Sergeant Daniel Kniep of the U.S. Army, a member of the 7th Cavalry Regiment's Company C, played a remarkable role in the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. Known for his bravery and vivid recollections, Neep stood out as one of the few survivors of this catastrophic clash between Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's forces and the combined Native American warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. His survival and subsequent testimony during the court of inquiry made him a key figure in unraveling the events that led to Custer's last stand. Neep's narrative begins with a fateful march on May 17, 1876, as his unit embarked on what would become a tragic expedition. The journey took them toward the Yellowstone River, where they camped at Big Heart River after covering 12 miles. Observing their surroundings, they pressed onward to the Powder River by June 10th. From there, 6 units were dispatched on reconnaissance missions, carrying provisions for 10 days on pack mules. Their path led them to the Rosebud River, where they discovered an Indian trail and turned toward the Tongue River, a prelude to the historic battle. The memoir Neep penned later. The Neep story became an invaluable historical source for understanding the complexities of Little Bighorn. His first-hand account sheds light on Custer's controversial decisions and the harrowing experiences of the soldiers during one of America's most infamous military defeats. Through his bravery and commitment to duty, Sergeant Kniep carved his place in American military history as an enduring figure whose voice continues to echo through time. As the sun began to set, we prepared some coffee and spent the entire night traversing the trail. The following morning, we brewed additional coffee and continued our journey along the route until midday. We retraced our steps down the Rosebud River after General Reno, the commander of our detachment, recognized that our supply of 10-day rations was dwindling. At the junction of the Rosebud and Yellowstone Rivers, we encountered the remaining 6 companies of the regiment under General Custer's command, along with General Terry, the department commander. It was reported that General Custer had been detained due to his opposition to the post merchants, who had benefited from concessions that were later revoked amid post-ridership scandals during President Grant's administration. Acquiring goods at the post office required purchasing them from these vendors, where a glass of alcohol cost 25 cents, typically served in small quantities. Custer's arrest stemmed from his imposition of a maximum price on these goods. Nevertheless, he was accompanied by other senior Army officers and was assigned command at the location I mentioned. On July 22nd, Custer's contingent received a supply of food sufficient for 15 days from the steamship Far West, which was docked on the river. Custer was equipped with 2 Gatling guns and 2 Rodman guns, which he ultimately surrendered to General Gibbon, who transported them across the river, believing they were unnecessary. In hindsight, this decision is viewed as a miscalculation. Had he retained one of the Rodman cannons and fired it even once, the Native Americans would not have ceased their retreat. It is likely that I would not have been the only survivor had we possessed a Gatling gun at that time. In fact, the infamous Custer Massacre might never have occurred. On June 22nd, we dismantled our camp and moved throughout the day. That night, Custer instructed that directions be communicated through hand signals, that no bugle calls would be sounded, and that only enough fire would be maintained to prepare coffee. We commenced a new journey on the morning of June 23rd. After marching until nearly dusk, we set up camp and continued our trek the next day, June 24th. On that day, we reached a site where the indigenous people had conducted both a war dance and a sun dance. Their activities had left the ground firm and smooth, and they had built brush huts using cottonwood trees. During our expedition, 6 Crow Indian scouts, who were part of our group, discovered the scalp of a white man, which belonged to a soldier under the command of Gibbon. The Crow, who harbored animosity towards the Sioux we were pursuing, were overjoyed to see the scalp hanging from a willow branch. They erupted in celebration, shouting, dancing, and yelling. Their excitement was palpable, and it would have been a grim day for the Sioux had they found one of their own in that situation. The scalp was returned to General Custer, who inspected it before handing it over to the troops. At the time of his death, it was stored in the saddle pockets of my company's senior line sergeant, Sergeant Finley. On June 24th, we marched throughout the day. Later that evening, around 10 o'clock, the Indian scouts who had been sent out earlier returned. It was dark, but during the summer, visibility was sufficient to read at 9 o'clock. That night, we were instructed to pack our gear and prepare our horses. We marched through the night, drawing closer to the confluence of the Little Bighorn and Rosebud rivers. General Custer led the regiment into a gully that seemed to offer a suitable hiding place for as long as we needed. However, as we entered at a brisk trot and gallop, Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst accidentally lost some hard bread from the packs of the supply train. Upon learning of this, General Custer ordered the sergeant to return and retrieve the bread. When the sergeant arrived at the spot where it had fallen, he found two Indians helping themselves to the bread. Upon noticing the advancing army, they quickly fled. Upon returning to camp, he reported the incident to General Custer, who then ordered us to prepare our horses. I presumed he aimed to catch the Indians off guard the following morning. However, given their awareness of our presence, he opted to take immediate action. After marching up the divide, we paused. General Custer departed for 2 hours with 2 scouts and Henry Voss, the chief trumpeter. Upon his return, he divided the regiment into 3 detachments. He assigned 3 soldiers, A, M, and G, to Major Reno. Captain McDougal was tasked with leading the pack train alongside Troop B, while Captain Benteen was given command of 3 troops, H, K, and D. General Custer retained troops C, E, I, and F for his own command. We set out after leaving our previous location. Major Reno was positioned to the left of General Custer, with Captain Benteen to his left. It was clear that 3 distinct approaches would be employed to assault the Indian camp. Captain McDougal was to guide the pack train along the main Indian trail. We proceeded down what is now known as Benteen's Creek until we reached a crossing where we encountered an abandoned Indian camp. The fires were still smoldering, and one of the remaining teepees contained a deceased Indian. General Custer ordered the teepee to be burned. When Major Reno arrived, he was instructed to cross Benteen Creek, which he did. General Custer advanced down the creek with 3 companies. As we approached within a quarter of a mile of the confluence of Benteen's Creek and the Little Bighorn, I spotted Indians atop the bluffs overlooking the river. I alerted First Sergeant Bobo to their presence. At that moment, General Custer glanced up, and Troops C, I, and F proceeded toward the bluffs where the Indians had been seen. Tom Custer, the general's brother, commanded my Troop C. Despite our swift ride, the Indians had disappeared by the time we reached the summit. However, the teepees were visible for miles around. Our Crow Indian scouts from the group planned to stealthily descend and capture a few ponies. Several individuals attempted to descend, but they were met with gunfire. Among those who remained on the bluffs with us were Bloody Knife Reeve, a Ree or Urucara, Curly, a Crow, and Chief Scout Mitch Bowie. We spurred our horses to the far end of the bluffs to prepare for an assault on the Indian camp, which became visible in the valley as the soldiers from the 4 companies began to shout and cheer. Sergeant Finkel was riding close to me, near Captain Tom Custer. He called out, expressing that he was nearing his limit as his horse struggled to keep pace. I responded, urging him to join us. He fell back slightly, and the captain then directed me to return and find McDougal, along with the pack train, to relay the orders just issued by General Custer. He instructed me to inform McDougal to move the pack train directly to the elevated ground, emphasizing that they should not stop to secure any loose packs, but rather cut them free and act swiftly, as a large Indian camp was nearby. I retraced my steps, initially perceiving this as a stroke of bad luck, but it ultimately proved to be a lifesaver. Had Sergeant Finkel received the orders instead, I might not be here recounting this tale, as he had retreated just moments before. In the distance, I could see dust rising from the pack train, resembling a small cloud. As my group and others advanced toward the Indian camp, I made my way in that direction. General Custer's last words echoed in my mind. We all rode at full speed, cheering for the soldiers as they ascended the hill. Some galloped past General Custer, struggling to control their mounts. "Hold your horses, boy," he shouted. "There are plenty down there for all of us." After they moved on, I rode back. After delivering the orders to Captain McDougal at the pack train, I made my way to Captain Benteen, as I had been directed to present the orders to him as well. Major Reno was in retreat from the base of the bluffs when McDougal and his men ascended the hill to provide support. Meanwhile, the Indians were shouting and firing, and casualties were occurring all around us. Before we could intervene, the Indians would pounce on the fallen and scalp them. Tragically, Dr. DeWolf was killed as he reached the top of the slope. Had he moved just a few steps further, he might have been spared. As I followed Captain Benteen back, I noticed some Indians rushing past. Initially, I prepared to fire at them, believing them to be hostile. But they turned out to be scouts fleeing the main battle. They were so frightened that they continued their flight until they reached the Powder River, having abandoned Major Reno's command. After relaying Captain Benteen's orders, I returned to the ridge with the battalion, where we rejoined Major Reno and McDougal. I was unable to rejoin my company due to the presence of Indians between us and General Custer. Following an attack by the Indians after Major Reno advanced onto the bluffs to confront them, we were forced to retreat and establish skirmish lines. We suffered several casualties before we could achieve this, with many men killed before we could reach them. The Indians continued to fire at us throughout the day and regrouped at night, only to resume their assault the following morning. I cannot specify how many, but we managed to inflict significant losses on them. There were 68 injured men in the camp, and we found ourselves cut off from water. It was devastating to hear the cries of an injured man pleading for water, yet we were unable to provide any relief. Some men were shot while trying to fetch water, and they could not return with any for the wounded. I vividly remember the first gunshot fired during the two-day battle. It struck the ground nearby and whizzed right under my horse's belly. Two officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, along with 14 soldiers, were never found. Witnesses reported that during the night celebrations, the Indians had decapitated them and paraded their heads. The Indians killed 56 members of our group on the hill. On the 26th, gunfire persisted throughout the day. By late evening, we noticed the camp beginning to pack up. While the women busily gathered their belongings, the warriors continued to shoot at us. On the morning of the 27th, there was not a single Indian in sight. We made coffee, gathered some water, and did our utmost to assist the injured. General Gibbon and his troops arrived around 10 o'clock, accompanied by General Terry. We greeted General Terry with loud cheers upon his arrival, and he was so moved that he wept openly. It became clear that General Custer and the four companies had been completely annihilated when he later reported seeing 200 troops in the valley below. Perhaps he had been ensnared like us, as we had suspected. Later that afternoon on the 27th, I was allowed to accompany Captain Benteen to the battlefield and explore the area freely. As I surveyed the deceased, I recognized a few acquaintances, including a sergeant I knew. Among the bodies, I found Sergeants Finkel and Finley. Sergeant Finley lay at the head of his horse, Carlo, with 12 arrows embedded in him. The bodies had been exposed to the sun for 2 days, bloodied and disfigured. After the women and young Indians stripped them of their clothing, they would repeatedly strike the men in the face with tomahawks or shoot them with arrows, making it easy to identify those who had been injured. They inflicted pain solely on the living, never on the deceased. None of the bodies were clothed. All garments had been taken by the Indians. It is likely they acquired approximately $25,000 in cash from us, as we had just received our pay at Powder River Camp, before setting out on this campaign, leaving us with no means to spend it. I could see where the last of them had fallen, gathered in a small heap. Only the lower part of General Custer's back rested on the ground, sprawled across a few men. He lay amidst the deceased, his heart pierced by a bullet. This final group was near my captain, Tom Custer, the general's brother, along with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, who led H Troop. Excluding the women, there were around 4,000 Indians involved in the conflict, contributing to a total of 12 to 15,000 Native Americans engaged in the battle. Custer and his troops faced an overwhelming adversary. No living soul remained on the battlefield to narrate the events that followed Custer's defeat along with his four companies. Captain Keogh's horse Comanche was the sole survivor of the massacre, having sustained 7 gunshot wounds before being found. Among the fallen soldiers, many dead Indians were also discovered. Approximately 75 Indians were located within 3 standing teepees, and it is impossible to determine how many more were taken away as the Native American camp relocated. One Indian I encountered was clad in buffalo robes and blankets. I was taken aback to find that he possessed 4 women's scalps, 2 of which had long red hair hanging from a string as lengthy as my arm when I cut him free. I promptly discarded the scalps due to the gruesome nature of the scene. I did not wish to be associated with such a disturbing trophy. After the battle, we laid our fallen comrades to rest before embarking on the arduous task of transporting the wounded to the steamboat located far to the west. The vessel had to retreat to the Yellowstone River after reaching its maximum distance upstream. A significant number of injured soldiers were brought aboard the steamboat for medical care, and fortunately, most of them made remarkable recoveries. Among the survivors was old Comanche, the sole survivor of Custer's ill-fated engagement. In remembrance of that tragic day, General Headquarters mandated that this horse would spend the remainder of his life in a box stall. Comanche received care from a soldier of the 7th Cavalry Band and was paraded at the front of the regiment during dress ceremonies, draped in a black mourning cloth. After the battle, the Native Americans simply dismantled their camp and continued their journey. My regiment, which had also fought in the battle, was not in a position to pursue them. We were all too severely injured and too exhausted to mount an effective counterattack. As a result, the Native Americans managed to escape without incurring further losses after their decisive victory. I hope this personal account provides you with a different perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos. Until next time.